So there are a few texts in Luke that I think are kind of important in this concept, talking about this concept of uh, personhood. Jumping around a little bit, I'm going to start in Luke chapter 12, verses 6 and 7. And it's interesting that Jesus, in teaching, says that God has not forgotten the sparrows, and the hairs of your head are numbered. Now I know the jokes. Okay, I understand this hairstyle and how much easier it is for God to number my hairs than it is for God to number your hairs. I get that. That's funny. Ha ha ha. Have your moment. But that was meant to be, humorous. Hopefully that translated. But the point still remains, if God remembers the sparrows, if he takes the time to know such intricate details, it's hyperbole, right? It's an overstatement to make a case. If God knows so much intimately about us, about the physical, what does that say about God's care for individuals and the dignity with which God has infused into humanity? So, personhood, to be a person means to be someone who's cared for by God. God sees, God understands, God hears. That's pretty important stuff. And there's any number of things that we could talk about with that. I could go on all day. Let's move on. But, okay, just one thing. You might want to look up in the Old Testament the narrative, the story about Hagar, Sarah's maid. In terms of God's care and oversight for the outcast, it's pretty important. All right, so going on with Luke, it's interesting the way Luke talks about the Sabbath with respect to humanity and personhood. And by personhood, I can't talk about personhood in the Bible without talking about dignity, the dignity that the human person has. So there are a couple of texts, one in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 to 5, and then one in Luke chapter 14, verses 1 to 6. And in both of those cases, there's this controversy about the Sabbath. And the Sabbath had become, by the first century, had become not only a marker of what it meant to be Jewish, which is very important, right? But it also had become this kind of legalistic yardstick by which one measures just how Jewish, just how good someone else is. And Jesus makes the case in these two passages. In Luke 6, he says, the Son of Man, by which he's speaking about himself, is the Lord of the Sabbath. So I precede the Sabbath. I got the Sabbath under control here, guys. And then in Luke chapter 14, he asks this question because he's getting ready to heal on the Sabbath, and he's getting all kinds of pushback for healing on the Sabbath, right? And he says, hey, which of you who had an ox that fell into a pit wouldn't go over and get him out, even if it was on the Sabbath? And they don't even answer. One of the things he's establishing therein, and we see it in other places, is that the Sabbath is created for humankind. We're not to be servants of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is something that helps us refresh, replenish, rejuvenate, right? Why? Because God is aware of our own weakness that we bring to the table. We get tired, we get worn out. I very rarely work on Saturday. Why? Well, Saturday, technically, actually, sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday is technically the Sabbath. Sunday is not the Sabbath. But I find that I'm better in 6 days when I have that day where I don't do any work. I hang out with my wife. I go for a walk. We go out to eat. We relax. We talk. We watch a movie. Whatever it is, we just relax. I'm better. And I know that you're under strain. You're working full time. Many of you have families. You're going to school. And so how does the Sabbath apply to you? I'm not really sure how you need to carve that out for yourself. But I will say this. God provides this language in the text about Sabbath keeping because God knows our weaknesses. He's mindful, as the psalmist says in chapter 103, that we are just dust, that we wear out. We're frail. I do better in 6 days when I take that day off because God plans for us in that way. Another text in Luke about personhood. It's interesting the way personhood and gender come together in Luke 21, 1-4. As you have the story about this little widow woman. Jesus observes her standing in line to, make her contribution, and she gives 2 small coins. And she's in line with these really rich cats, right? Who they give all kinds of money. And Jesus says of her, she's given more than they have. Why? Because she gave everything that she had. Wow. It's amazing, right? That personhood is not tied to how much we own or how much we have in our pockets or how much we give. Personhood is tied to a whole other set of priorities. Biblical personhood. Personhood as we see it in the scripture. And then that leads me to think about Luke chapter 22, verses 24 to 27. Jesus talks about what we know now as servant leadership, what we think about now as servant leadership. He says, the one that wants to be the greatest among you, and there was this dispute about who was going to be greatest in the kingdom. The greatest, that's the person that is the servant of everyone. So you want to be great in the kingdom of God? You've got to be a servant. I think that translates out beyond just this kind of religious kind of confine of the kingdom of God or the church. I think the people that make the lasting impression on us are the people that give of themselves. Not just their money, not just their time begrudgingly, but they give of themselves to us. That can be hard with some professions because you give and you give and you give. Around our family, we talk about my wife clicking in the nurse mode, and she gets very clinical and she's diagnosing the problem. That nurse mode, though, we all know, even though we joke with her about it, is rooted in a desire to make things better, to give of herself. It's not just a paycheck. It's calling, vocation. Vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, which means call. It's a self-conception that God has in some way called her to do this work. And I think people feel that in all kinds of different fields. You may feel it as a nurse, someone may feel it as a police officer, someone may feel it as a college professor, any number of ways, a carpenter, a plumber, right? This is what I'm on the earth to do. This is my contribution. That's being a servant. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Okay, so we're going to come back in a couple of minutes and talk about healthy relationships a little bit.